Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military with Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 7th of May of 2025. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. We are several hours away from the beginning of ceasefire that was announced by the President of Russian Federation Vladimir Putin. I'll remind you that several days ago he announced and he talked a lot about this ceasefire, but the problem is that yet we haven't received anything from Ukrainian side. Anything official, any official statement, official article, official note in any official social network wasn't made by the President of Ukraine Zelensky, which means that most likely neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians are going to follow this ceasefire, despite the fact that the Russians have announced this situation. For example, when talking about the situation in the air and the situation on the ground, we also see that nobody is moving towards this ceasefire. For example, today the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that the Russians during the previous night, during the previous 24 hours, managed to bring down and to destroy 524 drones that Ukrainians were using to attack deep inside of the territory of the Russia. Telling the truth, this is the biggest number of drones that Ukrainians have used since the beginning of the special military operation. This is not another step from the Ukrainian side towards this probably peaceful settlement of the conflict. This is another wave of escalation. Pro-Ukrainian sources during the previous 24 hours published lots of articles, lots of statements, lots of posts on different social networks regarding the results of this Russia-Ukraine attack. And Ukrainians reported that during the previous day they managed to damage or even to destroy several military facilities and military plants that the Russians were using for producing of their drones using on the type fiber optic technology. The Russians attacked Ukraine as well. When talking about the Russians, mainly they were attacking the city of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. We have several videos where we can see the consequences of Russian attacks, lots of fires, lots of explosions, lots of damage. The Ukrainians later provided us some statistics regarding work of their air defense system. In this article, we see that during the previous day, the Russians used just 187 drones, which 3 times less in comparison with the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians managed to bring down just 81 drones. So as you can see, the situation is very difficult. But there is one important thing and one important difference between any regular day of the special military operation and these upcoming 3 days of ceasefire. And the difference is that during the next 3 days, lots of heads of states are going to visit Moscow during Victory Day of 2025. We're going to see lots of leaders and lots of heads of different countries. And we're not talking about some unknown countries. We're talking about China, about Belarus, about Serbia, about Brazil, about Slovakia, about many other countries in Asia, in Africa, and so on. So there are going to be lots of people who will be completely unhappy if Ukrainians begin another provocation. Anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next. But once again, since the announcement of ceasefire from the Russian side, we still haven't received anything that can confirm that Ukrainians are going to do the same. Another important thing that, according to several sources, according to soldiers on the ground, according to those who has connections with soldiers on the ground and officers on the ground, Russian soldiers, the Russian army still hasn't received even a single order regarding this ceasefire. Yes, Putin announced ceasefire, but it doesn't mean that this ceasefire is going to start. You need not just to announce ceasefire, you need to sign an order and to provide this order to soldiers and officers on the ground. And nothing like this have happened by the end of the 7th of May of 2025. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground, and first let's talk about Kherson. Let's continue with the Kherson direction. During the previous 24 hours, we got another article published by more or less reliable resource that the Russians managed to cross the river of Dnipro in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Burgunka, and the Russians shown very successful work in this direction. So summarizing everything that we have received since the 30th of April of 2025, currently the Russians control almost everything in this, let's say, red cloud, according to different sources. Basically, the Russians established complete sabotage and reconnaissance groups control over the road R47 in the vicinity of Tyaginka, Burgunka, and in the vicinity of Pridniprovsk. This is very important because this situation, first of all, tells us that Ukrainians have very big problems with manpower and with soldiers in this direction. Because I'll remind you that during the previous mainly year, the Ukrainians were forced to redeploy lots of units and forces from the Kherson direction in the direction of Sumy area and in the Pokrovsk direction and in the direction of Kupiansk and Toretsk. So most likely the Russians are trying to understand whether they are able to get these territories under complete control if they start operation, whether the Ukrainians don't have enough of forces to stop or to slow down the Russians. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation in the direction of the settlements of Zelene Polye and Novopol. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians once again managed to improve their positions. The Russians are not going to stop, they are not planning to stop until they get these two settlements under complete control. Russian offensive operation in this area started somewhere on the 2nd of May of 2025. And since that moment, the Russians were improving their positions almost every single day, and the Russian offensive were taking and gaining momentum. As for now, according to several mappers and several resources, the Russians managed to shorten the distance between their positions and the village of Novopol to less than 1.2 kilometers, which means that if there is no ceasefire tomorrow, the Russians will begin offensive operation and they will answer at least this village. The situation for the Ukrainians is very difficult, but once again, we see that Zelensky is not going to accept this ceasefire. For him, it's better to continue war, to continue clashes and fighting with the Russians than just to regroup himself and to regroup his forces. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Dnipro or Novopavlovka direction. We have a lots of very important icons, we have a lots of very important updates. First of all, the Russians, according to several resources, according to pro-Russian and neutral resources, managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Kotlarovka. I expected that the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation would confirm this information today, but the Russians didn't say anything about this. Maybe they will confirm this information tomorrow. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their positions and to answer the settlement by the name of Troitskaya. This information was confirmed both by neutral mappers and by geolocation and video that was published by the Ukrainians. This video was published by the 72nd Mechanized Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, where we can see lots of FPV drone attacks on Russian units and soldiers in the vicinity of Troitskaya. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map. This is the situation by the end of the 6th of May, and this is the situation by the end of the 7th of May. The Russians answered the village of Troitsk. As for now, we can't say for sure whether the Russians established complete control, but obviously Russians managed to gain strategical foothold. Furthermore, several pro-Russian resources reported that the Russians also managed to improve their positions to the northwest of the settlement of Troitsk and to take under control another tree line. So according to this report, the Russians managed to shorten the distance to the border with Dnipro region to less than 2.5 kilometers, which means that maybe tomorrow the Russians will be able to answer the region as itself. Furthermore, and this is a small spoiler, today, right before I start making this video, the Russian sources reported, some Russian sources reported that the sabotage and reconnaissance group of the armed forces of the Russian Federation managed to enter Dnipro region, and maybe this upcoming night or tomorrow we're gonna see a video with the Russian flag on the territory of Dnipro region, which is going to be very powerful and significant media victory for the Russians. Another important thing that I would like to point to attention, that starting on the 7th of May, we began receiving more and more videos where we can see how the Russians were attacking, bombing and destroying vehicles with FPV drones on the territory of Dnipro region. For example, during the previous 24 hours, we got at least 2 geolocated episodes already on the territory of Dnipro region. For example, if we increase the numbers of updates since the beginning of April, we're gonna see just 3 icons for almost 40 days. And 2 of these icons took place during the previous 24 hours. This is very important, which means that the front line is moving on the territory of Dnipro region, and the Ukrainians, as for now, can't do anything with this. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Pokrovsk direction. During the previous 24 hours, according to several icons and geolocations that were provided by different sources, the Russians were located and were discovered, spotted on the territory of the eastern part of Sergeyevka. In this video, we can see how Ukrainians were counterattacking Russians in this area. Based on this video and based on several updates that were published by different mappers, we have adjusted the map. As for the city of Pokrovsk, the Russians are bombing and attacking this settlement with all heavy calibers they have. For example, in this video we can see how the Russians were trying to damage and destroy Ukrainian temporary deployment points and strongholds along the railways between the settlement of Pishane and the settlement of Pokrovsk. So in this video the Russians destroyed positions of the armored forces of Ukraine here. We expect that probably after the end of the ceasefire, if ceasefire ever happens, the Russians will move further along the railways. Furthermore, the Russians were bombing the settlement of Mirnograd. In this video we can see how the Russians using FAB 500 or FAB 1500 were bombing the most southern part of the settlement, probably preparing this foothold before offensive operation. In the northern direction we can see another FAB strike. So as you can see, there were almost no activities on the ground when talking about offensive operation or something like this, but the Russian aviation was working in the full strength. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation on the eastern flank of the Pokrovsk agglomeration. We have almost discussed everything during the previous video. I would like to point your attention once again that today, according to this video that was published by the Russian resource 2 majors, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the settlement of Nova Lenovka. In this video we can see how Russian motorbikers entered the settlement and established complete control over the most northern part, while the main Russian forces were moving from the south. And in the final part of this video we can see how a Russian soldier was waving with the Russian flag right in the central part and in the northern part of the settlement. So based on this video we have adjusted the map. Furthermore, several mappers reported that the Russians managed to improve their positions even more and to get as close as possible to N32 road. We believe that N32 road is already cut by the Russians. So now we see that the Russians are trying to take this company stronghold in pincers. We believe that the Russians are going to take this company stronghold under complete control either during the ceasefire period of time or right after. If the Russians establish complete control over this territory, this is going to be probably the biggest victory of the Russians in this direction, because this powerful stronghold will allow the Russians to move further in many directions, including N32 road in the direction of the settlement of Konstantinovka, in the direction of the northeastern part of the settlement of Novoekonomichny, and further in the western direction towards the village of Rodinskaya. So from these positions the Russians can do a lot of very probably unpleasant things for the Ukrainians. Now let's talk about the Kliban-Bykske, let's say pocket. We have lots of important icons. According mainly to pro-Russian sources, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to establish complete control over the settlement of Alexandropol. This information once again was provided by pro-Russian resources. As for pro-Ukrainian sources, they haven't confirmed anything. At the same time, according to information we have, the Russians began advancing in the fields in the northeastern direction with the purpose to get under control the supply lines that Ukrainians use to support their forces in the southern part of this pocket. So we see that the Russians began tightening the news around Ukrainian positions in this Kliban-Bykske pocket, which is very important. We expect that During the next days, Russian offensive will intensify, and the most important, Ukrainians sooner or later most likely would be forced to fall back from this area. Now let's move further. As for the Toriez direction, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything special. There are lots of videos, some icons, but we see that the front line was stabilized in this direction. Neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians are advancing, just very heavy clashes along the line of combat contact. Most likely the Russians are waiting for the end of this upcoming ceasefire, and then they will resume their attempts to attack in the northern direction. As for the city of Chasiv Yar, the main activities was spotted to the northwest of the settlement. The Russians improved their positions, and we have video that confirmed this. In this video we can see how the Russians were advancing in the northwestern direction and took under control another stronghold under very heavy fire from the Ukrainian side. We need to understand that currently the Russians, and in the very near future and during the final stage of the major battle of 2025, will try to establish complete control over positions of the armored forces of Ukraine along the railways almost until the settlement of Bilokuzminovka, and then the Russians will try to maintain the lines until the canal of Siversk Donetsk-Donbass. So this is approximately the plan and task for the Russians for the next several months. To establish complete control over this pocket, this will allow the Russians to improve their positions between two barriers, the railways and the Siversk Donetsk-Donbass canal. And if the Russians are able to establish complete control over this pocket, I have some doubts that Ukrainians will be able to force the Russians to fall back. This is very powerful stronghold, very powerful strategical positions. From this area, the Russians will be able to establish complete fire control over the main supply lines that go between the settlements, and this is going to be the beginning of complete disaster for the armored forces of Ukraine. So something like this we expect in the very near future to happen in this area. As for the Siversk direction, the Russians resumed their activities. Today we got very important geolocation that was published by the Ukrainian sources from the 54th Mechanized Brigade. In this video we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russian units and Russian soldiers in the fields. The video is probably long, 2 minutes, and several episodes were geolocated. One of the episodes took place exactly in this point. The Russians managed to outflank the settlement of Verkhnykamensk from the north and to establish complete control over this territory. This is the situation by the big end of the 6th of May, and this is the situation by the end of the 7th of May. As you can see, now the Ukrainians have problems to hold their positions in Verkhnykamensk, and we expect that due to this situation, there are very high chances that Ukrainians in the very near future would be forced to fall back from Verkhnykamensk in the direction of the city of Siversk. If this happens, if the Russians are able to establish complete control over this territory, this is also going to be something like beginning of complete disaster for Ukrainians in the Siversk direction, because from the settlement of Verkhnykamensk there is a straight road to the city of Siversk and the battle for the city at Siversk itself. Furthermore, the Russians continue offensive operation in the Liman direction, and today the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that during the previous 24 hours the Russians secured the village of Lipovo completely. So the group of forces west was responsible for this offensive. Anyway, despite the fact that the Russians secured the village, we see that the Russians slowed down. It's very difficult to understand why the Russians decided to slow down. Maybe the Russians are regrouping, maybe the Russians are waiting for the end of ceasefire and they then will resume. Anyway, we're going to understand this during the next several days. As for the northern directions, we have lots of important updates, and based on the geolocations and videos that were published by the Russian side, we can make a conclusion that Ukrainians' attempts to answer the territory of Kursk region failed. Ukrainians tried to breach Russian defense in multiple places, at least in 3 directions, but most their attempts failed because the Ukrainians lost every single engineering equipment they had, and this is now a very huge problem. We need to understand that mainly the Ukrainians were focused on the mining area and removing of dragon teeth. And now the Ukrainians have no equipment, no vehicles to do this. Furthermore, on those positions at some places where the Ukrainians managed to remove barriers for further offensive, we see that the Russians destroyed their vehicles, and now Ukrainians need to remove abandoned and destroyed vehicles if they want to continue. So I'm not sure what Ukrainians are planning to do tomorrow, but as for now, we see that Ukrainians' attempts to enter the territory of Russian Federation failed. There is just one place where the Ukrainians, according to different geolocations, managed to enter the territory of Russia, and we have already discussed this video, but the problem is that right before we started making this video, several pro-Russian resources reported that as a result of counterattacks, Ukrainians were forced to fall back from this area. So this is a report that was published by the Russian sources. Ukrainians lost control over one single street they established control this morning. So this is the situation, and we see that very interesting hours are ahead of us. So let's wait and see what is going to be next, but obviously the situation can change in any moment. And that's it for today. Military with Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.